The year 1975. A low hum of fluorescent lights fills a committee room on Capitol Hill. Senator Frank Church, his brow furrowed, sifts through heavily redacted documents. His committee, charged with investigating intelligence activities, has unearthed unsettling connections between the nation's premier spy agency and the very institutions tasked with informing the public. Did the American public, he might have wondered, truly grasp the invisible hand guiding the flow of news, shaping perceptions, in the name of national security? The question hangs in the air, a shadow cast over the integrity of a free press. To understand the tremor of that moment, one must first journey back to the crucible of the Cold War. The ashes of the Second World War had barely settled when a new ideological conflict ignited, pitting the capitalist West against the communist East. Washington, D.C., once a city of sleepy southern charm, now pulsed with a frantic energy, a nerve center for global strategy. The Soviet Union, a monolithic power, loomed large, its expansionist ambitions perceived as an existential threat to American ideals. This was not a war of tanks and trenches, but of ideas, of hearts and minds, fought in the propaganda leaflets of distant lands and, crucially, within the pages of newspapers and across the airwaves. In this atmosphere of profound geopolitical tension, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947, swiftly expanded its mandate beyond mere intelligence gathering. Its architects and operators, often veterans of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, understood the potent force of public opinion. They believed that information was a weapon, and like any weapon, it could be wielded for strategic advantage. The agency's mission, as they saw it, was not just to collect secrets, but to shape realities, both abroad and, more controversially, at home. The lines between information dissemination and propaganda became increasingly blurred, justified by the overriding imperative of national security. How could one counter the pervasive narratives emanating from Moscow without engaging in a similar, if more sophisticated, battle for perception? This was the driving question, a complex moral and strategic dilemma for a democratic nation. The methods employed were often subtle, evolving from ad hoc wartime initiatives into a more structured, though still highly compartmentalized approach. One key strategy involved covert funding. The CIA, unable to directly engage in public relations or propaganda campaigns within the United States due to legal restrictions, established a labyrinthine network of front organizations. These included seemingly innocuous cultural foundations, student groups, labor unions, and academic institutions. Funds would flow through intermediaries, often respected figures in society, who themselves might not be fully aware of the ultimate source of their grants. The goal was to support projects that, while ostensibly independent, aligned with American foreign policy objectives and countered Soviet influence. For instance, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a prominent organization founded in 1950, actively promoted Western democratic values and intellectual thought, publishing respected journals like Encounter. For years, its funding source remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few within its leadership. This clandestine patronage allowed the agency to cultivate an intellectual and artistic sphere that championed American ideals without the overt appearance of government control, thus lending more credibility to the message. Another avenue of influence involved direct, if informal, cooperation with American journalists and media outlets. Many reporters, editors, and publishers, steeped in the patriotic fervor of the post-war era, saw themselves as part of the broader national effort against communism. They were, in many cases, willing to assist their government, viewing it as a civic duty rather than a compromise of journalistic integrity. The CIA cultivated these relationships, not always with explicit requests for propaganda, but often by providing exclusive information, access to officials, or even facilitating foreign travel for journalists. This symbiotic relationship allowed the agency to subtly steer narratives, highlight stories favorable to U.S. policy, or suppress information deemed detrimental to national interests. It was a gentleman's agreement, built on trust and a shared sense of purpose, yet it created a dangerous precedent. Picture a dimly lit office in a Washington, D.C. news bureau, circa 1958. Benjamin Thorne, a seasoned foreign correspondent for a major wire service, adjusts his spectacles, a faint scent of stale tobacco clinging to his tweed jacket. Across from him sits a man introduced simply as Mr. Miller, a well-dressed individual with an air of quiet authority. Mr. Miller, a purported State Department liaison, slides a slim dossier across the desk. Inside are photographs and documents purporting to expose a new surge of Soviet espionage in a particular South American nation. This information, Mr. Miller begins, his voice low and even, is highly sensitive, Mr. Thorne. It's crucial the public understands the extent of Soviet encroachment. We believe you, with your expertise in the region, are uniquely positioned to articulate the gravity of the situation. Thorne pores over the papers, his journalistic instinct stirring. He sees a compelling story, one that aligns with his own convictions about the communist threat. No explicit demands are made, no payment offered, beyond the implied prestige of an exclusive scoop and the subtle flattery of his unique position. Yet the unspoken understanding hangs heavy. This story, when published, will serve a purpose beyond mere reporting. It will buttress a particular foreign policy stance, shaping public opinion in a way that benefits official narratives. Thorne, believing he's merely pursuing a vital truth, will craft his report, unaware of the deeper layers of influence at play, the strategic puppetry that orchestrates the flow of information. He will return to his typewriter, the rhythmic clack-clack filling the quiet office, shaping words that will eventually reach millions of breakfast tables, subtly nudging their worldview. These early, often informal practices laid the insidious groundwork for a more pervasive engagement between intelligence agencies and the media. While many journalists and editors genuinely believed they were acting in the national interest, the consequence was a gradual erosion of the perceived independence of the press. The public, largely unaware of these hidden connections, consumed news that was in part curated or influenced by covert government operations. This created a fertile ground for skepticism and distrust, a seed that would eventually blossom into widespread public cynicism when revelations finally emerged decades later. The very foundation of a democratic society, an informed citizenry capable of making independent judgments, was subtly undermined, not by overt censorship, but by the strategic manipulation of the information environment. The ethical boundaries of journalism became hazy, obscured by the fog of war and the exigencies of national security. It is at this juncture that the historical narrative diverges into several interpretations, particularly regarding the nebulous term Operation Mockingbird. Some researchers argue that Mockingbird was never a single, centrally coordinated program, but rather an umbrella term retrospectively applied to a multitude of discrete, often ad hoc operations involving media influence. They point to the highly compartmentalized nature of the CIA's early operations, suggesting that while individual journalists or outlets might have cooperated with the agency, there was no grand, overarching conspiracy to control the entirety of the American press. This perspective views the intelligence agency's media engagement as a series of opportunistic endeavors, leveraging existing patriotic sentiments and professional relationships rather than a systematic infiltration. Conversely, another school of thought posits that Operation Mockingbird, or similar programs, represented a deliberate, extensive, and systematic effort to infiltrate and control major media outlets, both domestically and internationally. Adherents of this view emphasize the sheer volume of alleged interactions between the CIA and media figures, claiming that the agency maintained a vast network of assets capable of shaping public discourse on a grand scale. They argue that the cumulative effect of these seemingly disparate operations amounted to a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare against the American public, creating a consensus that served the interests of the intelligence community and government policy. A third, more nuanced interpretation acknowledges the existence of significant covert media influence operations, while cautioning against overstating their singular coordination or absolute control. This perspective suggests that the CIA undoubtedly cultivated relationships with journalists and media organizations, provided them with information, and, on occasion, leveraged them for propaganda purposes. However, it also emphasizes that the agency operated within a complex ecosystem of competing interests, bureaucratic inertia, and the inherent independence and often skepticism of the journalistic profession. The influence was real and substantial, but perhaps less monolithic and less conspiratorial than some popular accounts suggest, existing more as a pervasive pattern of behavior rather than a single, meticulously planned operation. The truth, like many complex historical events, likely lies somewhere amidst these interpretations, a mosaic of intentions, actions, and unintended consequences. But one question remains, a nagging echo through the decades. How deeply did these practices embed themselves, and what would it take for the public to finally uncover them? The year 1975 marked a turning point, a crescendo of public distrust in government, fueled by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, had finally compelled Congress to act. Suddenly, the shadows in the intelligence community, long shrouded in secrecy, began to recede, revealing glimpses of unsettling truths. It was a period of profound introspection for the nation, forcing a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that the guardians of democracy had, at times, operated outside its most cherished principles. The revelations that spilled forth from various inquiries, particularly the hearings led by Senator Frank Church, would forever alter the public's perception of both government and the Fourth Estate. The tumultuous 1960s and early 1970s had stripped away much of the post-war innocence. The seemingly boundless confidence in American institutions had fractured under the weight of an unpopular war in Southeast Asia, which many felt had been fought on a foundation of government deception. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, laid bare a history of official lies and strategic miscalculations. Then came Watergate, a scandal that began with a seemingly minor break-in and escalated into a constitutional crisis, exposing systematic abuses of power at the highest levels of government. In this climate, investigative journalism, once a niche pursuit, became a potent force, celebrated for its role in holding power accountable. The public, feeling betrayed, was hungry for truth, even if that truth was deeply unsettling. It was against this backdrop of national disillusionment that the extent of intelligence agencies' involvement with the media began to surface, not as whispers or rumors, but as documented, albeit often redacted, fact. The first significant crack in the wall of secrecy came even before the Church Committee. In 1967, Ramparts magazine published an exposé revealing that the National Student Association, a prominent student organization, had been secretly funded by the CIA for years. This revelation sent shockwaves through the academic and activist communities, shattering the illusion of independent student movements and raising questions about how many other ostensibly autonomous groups were, in fact, conduits for government influence. However, it was the Church Committee, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, that truly opened the floodgates. Established in 1975, its mandate was broad: to investigate alleged abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS. Among its voluminous findings, released in 1975 and 1976, were detailed accounts of the CIA's extensive covert propaganda operations. The committee documented how the agency had engaged in hundreds of covert contacts with news organizations and journalists, utilizing them for intelligence gathering and the dissemination of propaganda. It revealed the CIA's ownership of proprietary media assets abroad and its cultivation of a network of sympathetic journalists, both domestically and internationally. While the Church Committee did not explicitly use the term Operation Mockingbird, its findings provided the definitive official acknowledgement that the CIA had indeed engaged in widespread, often secret, manipulation of media. Building upon these official revelations, legendary investigative journalist Carl Bernstein, famous for his work on Watergate, published a seminal article in Rolling Stone in 1977 titled "The CIA and the Media." Bernstein, through extensive interviews with former intelligence officials, named specific journalists and media executives who had allegedly cooperated with the CIA over decades. He claimed that over 400 American journalists had secretly carried out assignments for the intelligence agency. His reporting suggested that major news organizations, including the New York Times, CBS News, and Time magazine, had provided cover for CIA agents or had their employees serve as assets, wittingly or unwittingly. While Bernstein's article sparked intense debate and was met with strong denials from some implicated parties, it cemented in the public consciousness the idea of a deep and systemic entanglement between the U.S. intelligence apparatus and the American press, giving widespread currency to the Mockingbird narrative. The methods as revealed by these investigations and journalistic exposés were varied and insidious. One common practice was the placement of stories. CIA assets, whether journalists, editors, or foreign contacts, would plant articles, editorials, or news items in publications, either locally or internationally. These stories, carefully crafted by the agency, would promote a particular viewpoint, discredit an adversary, or bolster a policy decision, all while appearing to be independent journalistic reporting. For example, a journalist traveling abroad on an ostensibly legitimate assignment might be asked to submit a report on local political conditions, incorporating specific narratives or observations provided by their handler. Another technique involved providing information. This often meant leaking selective intelligence to sympathetic journalists, portraying it as an exclusive scoop. The information might be factual, but presented in a way that served the agency's agenda, omitting crucial context or emphasizing certain aspects to steer public opinion. A reporter might receive a tip about a looming communist threat in a Latin American nation, complete with evidence that, while authentic, was deliberately incomplete, designed to create a specific impression. Perhaps most controversially, the CIA was accused of recruiting journalists as assets. Some journalists, driven by patriotic zeal or career ambition, willingly provided intelligence or allowed their journalistic activities to be used as cover for clandestine operations. Others might have been cultivated unwittingly, simply believing they were assisting a government agency in a legitimate capacity, unaware of the deeper manipulative intent. These journalists, with their access to foreign countries, government officials, and diverse social circles, were invaluable for intelligence gathering and for discreetly disseminating information. Finally, the agency, particularly abroad, engaged in the creation or acquisition of proprietary organizations. These were media outlets, publishing houses, or radio stations secretly owned or controlled by the CIA, presenting themselves as independent entities but serving as direct conduits for agency propaganda. The scale of these operations, involving hundreds of assets and numerous media entities, suggested a sophisticated and pervasive effort to manage the information landscape. Consider a quiet, nondescript office in McLean, Virginia in the early 1970s. Special Agent Harris, a man whose tailored suits never quite disguised the tension in his shoulders, reviews a file on an upcoming foreign election. He makes a call. "Is our friend at the World Review still amenable?" he asks into the receiver, his voice barely a murmur. "Good. We have a piece on the challenger's alleged ties to Havana. It's compelling. Ensure it gets prominent placement within the next 48 hours." Meanwhile, across town, within the bustling newsroom of the World Review, Eleanor Vance, a young, ambitious editorial assistant, receives an urgent memo from her managing editor. It's a late submission, an unsourced opinion piece about a foreign politician, presented with an almost imperceptible urgency. "This needs to run," the note reads. "Top of the international section. Tomorrow's edition." Eleanor, focused on deadlines and layout, barely registers the unusual timing or the subtle pressure. She assumes it's a priority piece from a respected, though unnamed source, or perhaps a late-breaking analysis. She typesets the article, its words painting a damning portrait of a foreign leader, a portrait skillfully crafted not by a detached observer, but by an intelligence agency operating in the shadows. The article, once published, will join the chorus of voices shaping opinion, unaware that its roots trace back to a phone call in a suburban Virginia office. Its purpose not to inform, but to subtly influence the outcome of a distant election. The hum of the printing presses that night will carry not just news, but an orchestrated whisper. The fallout from these revelations was profound. For many, it shattered faith in the impartiality of the press, creating a deep and lasting suspicion that news sources could not be fully trusted. The boundary between journalism and intelligence, once thought sacrosanct in a democracy, appeared disturbingly porous. This erosion of public trust had far-reaching implications, contributing to a more cynical populace less likely to believe official narratives or even mainstream media reports. It fueled a growing appetite for alternative news sources and conspiracy theories, as people struggled to discern truth from manipulation. For the journalistic profession itself, the revelations spurred a period of intense self-reflection and calls for stricter ethical guidelines, a renewed commitment to independence, and a greater transparency regarding sources and potential conflicts of interest. The idea of the watchdog media, holding power accountable, suddenly seemed compromised by its own hidden alliances. Even after the Church Committee and Bernstein's article, the exact scope and nature of Operation Mockingbird remain a subject of fervent debate. One skeptical view maintains that while the CIA undeniably engaged in media influence operations, the term Mockingbird itself is largely a sensationalized creation, a catch-all phrase that has been inflated into a grand, monolithic conspiracy. Proponents of this view argue that many of the agency's interactions were opportunistic, reactive, and often uncoordinated, rather than part of a single, centrally commanded program. They suggest that the number of witting assets was smaller than often alleged, and that the overall impact, while not insignificant, did not amount to a total control of the American press. This perspective often highlights the independent spirit of many journalists and editors who, even if approached, would have resisted overt attempts at manipulation. On the other end of the spectrum, a more conspiratorial view argues that Operation Mockingbird was indeed a vast, deliberate, and highly effective program that systematically infiltrated and controlled a significant portion of the major news media for decades. Adherents to this perspective believe that the revelations of the 1970s were merely the tip of the iceberg, and that the deeper, more pervasive influence continues to this day, shaping public discourse on critical issues. They often point to the consistent messaging on certain foreign policy matters or the selective coverage of domestic events as evidence of ongoing subtle manipulation. A balanced perspective, seeking to navigate between these extremes, acknowledges the compelling evidence of extensive covert media influence by the CIA and other intelligence agencies during the Cold War. It recognizes that such operations were a significant, if often hidden, feature of the geopolitical landscape. However, it also emphasizes that the mechanisms of influence were complex, involving a spectrum from unwitting cooperation to deliberate collaboration, and from subtle narrative shaping to outright propaganda. It suggests that while the term Operation Mockingbird may not refer to a single, tightly managed program, it has become a potent symbol and shorthand for a historical reality: the undeniable and often ethically fraught entanglement between the custodians of state secrets and the gatekeepers of public information. The echoes of these practices continue to resonate in contemporary debates about media bias, fake news, and the challenge of discerning truth in an increasingly complex information environment. How then, in an age saturated with digital chatter and instant dissemination, do societies protect the integrity of information, and where do the lines of influence truly begin and end?